start recording, please. Okay.
And can you see the slides, the lecture slides as well?
Yes. Yes, we can see that.
Perfect. All set. Okay. Well, I would have loved to be there in person as well, obviously, but I couldn't reschedule my teaching at my university because of the big classes I have to teach, especially in this block. But at least this way I can contribute to the conference. And today I will be talking about a conceptual engineering approach to mystical experiences. So my interest in this topic started with an observation we did using a placebo guard helmet. So this was work we did in the 2015s, where we started using the Persinger helmet, which has been developed as a device that applies electromagnetic stimulation to the brain to induce mystical type experiences. We used the placebo version of the guard helmet, and in several studies, we found that even if you don't stimulate participants' brain, but if you provide the right framing and the right setting, and if you induce expectations that the device will trigger mystical experiences, that quite a lot of people within that context report having mystical type experiences. We've recently conducted a follow-up study on that using data from 80 participants to get an in-depth assessment of the type of experiences that people report. Well, this is showing the power of placebo, of course, and also the power of suggestibility, because not everyone has these experiences, especially highly suggestible participants appear prone to this. And this led us at the time to propose a causal mechanistic model of mystical type experiences, starting from the premise of the predictive processing theory of the brain. And in this paper, we tried to synthesize what was known at the time about the mechanisms underlying not only mystical experiences, but also religious visions and meditation and prayer experiences. And specifically for mystical experiences, one idea that we came up with is that mystical experiences can be characterized by a balanced processing between interoceptive and exteroceptive information, where there's a shift towards like less relying on your internal model of the self, towards integrating external information in your self model. And this also, at the time, was supported by a couple of neuroimaging studies, neuroscience studies on mystical experiences. So we tried to support the model that we developed with published research at the time. But since then, we have moved on and we conducted follow-up studies to actually see if we could validate some of the predictions that we developed in this paper. And that turned out to be quite difficult, and hence also triggered in myself and my colleagues a more skeptical outlook for the prospects of a neuroscience of mystical experiences. So for instance, here we set out a study to investigate if proneness to having had mystical experiences is associated to differences in gray matter volume in pre-specified brain regions, including the orbital frontal cortex, the medial temporal lobe, and the inferior parietal lobe. So we had a pre-specified regions of interest. And as you can see, the effect of mystical experience was 0. And how can this be? Well, there can be many reasons for this. There's of course, a discrepancy between previous published findings, but those published findings typically had smaller sample sizes. And this was a study with about 200 participants. And if you scale up, the effect sizes typically decrease, and it turns out to be much more difficult to relate such a high-level concept as mystical experiences to differences in gray matter volume. Another reason might be that just looking at gray matter differences using voxel-based morphometry is a very crude tool to assess proneness to having a mystical type experience. So in a different study, published together with Michael Lifshitz and Manish Girn, we set out to use more fancy tools for brain measuring what happens in the brain. So next to voxel-based morphometry, we also looked at resting state functional connectivity. So you can look at the functional pattern of changes in the brain, modularity, to what extent the brain can be characterized by different modules or to what extent it is integrated, and so-called cortical gradients, to what extent there's like compression of information across different brain regions. And this study focused on the personality trait of absorption. So it's not directly looking at mystical experiences, but we know that absorption captures a propensity for having mystical type experiences. And also here we try to validate some of the predictions from the theory of predictive processing. We did this in a discovery data set of 200 participants, and we tried to replicate all those findings in a replication data set. Unfortunately, none of the results could be replicated. So I find it quite illuminating that if you apply all these fancy methods to one data set, that it turns out you get quite interesting patterns, and you can think about what it might actually mean. Those are represented here. But if you then move on in an independent data set and you try to replicate the same findings, it turned out that none of those findings actually held up. And that's just pointing out the mere difficulty of looking at those brain behavior correlations, that it's just not as simple to detect how the brain correlates to, for instance, proneness to mystical type experiences. And these days, many people also converge on the conclusion that if you want to establish these patterns, you don't need data from 10 or 100 participants, but you more likely need data from thousands of participants to pick up on these correlations. So this makes the prospect of a neuroscience of mystical experiences a bit less likely. On top of that, last year, we organized a workshop on so-called mystical entropy. So this is part of the Mystical Entropy project, which I co-organized with Aidan Lyon, a philosopher of science. And as part of this entropy project, we'll say more about this towards the end of this presentation, we organized a workshop on mystical experiences. And we invited experts from all types of different fields, including neuroscientists, psychologists, philosophers, religious scholars, to think about what is a mystical experience. And if anything came out of that workshop, the rather disappointing take-home message that I took from this is that there is no agreed upon definition of what a mystical experience is. Because one scholar might say it is the meeting with God, another scholar might say it's a pure consciousness event, a meditator might say it's the experience of non-dual awareness, and so on. There are almost as many definitions as there are different scholars. And this basically provided the basis for what I would like to present today, the conceptual engineering approach to mystical experiences. So if you think about what a mystical experience is, of course, it has a long and rich history among scholars from different scientific disciplines. And I think a very useful review on the concept of mystical experiences is provided in this paper, The Making of Modern Mysticism, by Schmidt in 2003, in which he actually nicely describes the emergence of the concept of the mystical. But it also points out that this, the notion or the invention of the term mystical was often very strongly driven by a theological agenda to kind of set apart a class of experiences from scientific investigation, the so-called sui generis approach. Another excellent review paper is by N. Taves, 2021, Mystical and Other Alterations in the Sense of Self, in which he argues that mystical experiences as a kind of category of scientific investigation have undergone a process from very broad to more narrow definitions over the course of time. And this is exemplified also in the resurgence of interest in mystical experiences in psychedelic science, as for instance in this review paper by Kangas Lampi. So in psychedelic science, there's an interest in mystical experiences because mystical experiences seem to predict therapeutic outcomes. And they're often measured using the mystical experience questionnaire. This is a very narrow and precise definition, it seems, which also suffers from a couple of methodological shortcomings. And this in response has led to what has been characterized in the literature as the mysticism wars. And this is a term that originates from Chris Letherby, a philosopher who has coined this term to refer to a debate that started in 2021 by a paper by Sanders and Zijlmans, in which they actually argue that in psychedelic science, but maybe also in science more broadly, we need to move beyond the notion of mystical experiences. And they bring up a couple of arguments for doing so. They argue that the concept of mystical experiences often conflates science with supernatural beliefs, that it induces a black box approach that prevents us from developing a causal mechanistic theory. By using the notion of mystical experiences, you can actually prime people to have such experiences, and that in turn might bias the research outcomes, for instance with the God helmet, but also in psychedelic clinical trials. And this results also in public misperception, because the lay people might think that a mystical experience is a scientific construct, but in fact it is a way in which it also might bring in bias. Well, this paper has been quite influential and has triggered a lot of responses. So I list the couple of responses published in the literature here. So in response, we published a paper in 2021 in which we actually point out there's a rich history of research on mystical experiences that we need to embrace in order to move forward. The philosopher Jussi Ilkka argued that it is possible to reconcile mystical experiences with naturalistic psychedelic science. How to pronounce the name? Mosorinjon and colleagues have actually argued that we need to more carefully look at cultural differences in psychedelic-induced mystical experiences to do justice to the variety of mystical experiences. And more recently, Chris Lefferby has proposed in a chapter How to End the Mysticism Wars in Psychedelic Science, where he basically reconciles the debate. He says there are pro-mystics and anti-mystics in the literature, but at the heart of the debate are a couple of conceptual problems that need to be addressed. Well, thinking about this a bit more, I think at the heart of this debate, there are three key problems that continue to exist. And those are, first off, the framing problem. The second is the definition problem. The third is the validity or the measurement problem. So the framing problem refers to the notion that inherent to the concept of mystical experiences is the notion that hinders measurements. So for instance, if you think that a mystical experience is ineffable or paradoxical, this already precludes the possibility to measure such an experience and might bring in bias towards a supernatural agenda and might also prime people to have these type of experiences or to seek out these experiences. The definition problem. No agreed upon definition of mystical experiences in the literature. If you think mystical experiences are a sui generis category, that precludes them from scientific investigation. If you take a perennialist view, there's no agreement on the core elements and how they actually tend to co-occur. And alternatively, if you don't think there's a common core, that basically renders the whole concept of mystical experiences also useless, because there is no such thing as a unifying mystical experience. And then the measurement problem or the validity problem is pointing out that the most widely used measures to measure mystical experiences often lack validity. So many people think that these skills have been validated, and it is often argued that these skills have been validated, but if you closely look at the validation process, the psychometric properties of mystical experiences, such as, for instance, Rolf Hood's M scale or Barrett's MEQ scale, what is missing is an expert opinion, agreement among the experts on what a mystical experience is and how it should be measured. A second problem is that the items of the scales are often ambiguous and unclear, and they have not been validated by asking respondents to check if they understand what the item means. And thirdly, many of the items often conflate belief about mysticism with experiences about that are deemed mystical. So for instance, an item like I had an experience that felt more real than real already presumes the existence of belief in something that is more real than real. And it conflates the belief that something like that exists and having had the experience of something like that. So I think a way forward is to set aside the notion of mystical experiences for a while and reflect on how we can actually purify or refine the concept of mystical type experiences through a reiterative process that takes into account notions from conceptual engineering, such as concept utility. Do the concepts in the framework allow research to identify the phenomenon of interest so that it can be scientifically tested? Intelligibility. Are the concepts defined in such a way that they have the largest categories of sufficiently similar objects? So can you allow scientific generalizations? Is the conceptual scheme flexible? So can you easily revise the framework, and openness. To what extent is the framework that tries to explain mystical experiences as compatible with as many hypotheses as possible? So, for instance, does it start from methodological agnosticism? So in order to apply this, I think if we think about measuring mystical experiences, it is important to distinguish experiences from belief and to retain the phenomenological features that are clearly defined and measurable, such as, for instance, unity or loss of sense of space and time, and get rid of the notions that are clearly ambiguous and that can be interpreted in different ways. And then through an iterative process, we can ultimately develop a network of model of mystical experiences. And this is something that we propose in a chapter that I co-wrote with Geraldine Carant, in which we make use of network tools. So the basic idea here is that instead of being a latent construct, a common core underlying the variety of mystical experiences across cultures, you can think of these experiences as nodes within a network. And the nodes can consist, of course, of phenomenological features, such as, for instance, sense of unity, but it can also contain other aspects, such as neural nodes or social nodes or cultural beliefs, etc. And then one way forward is that through an iterative process, we can see how those nodes cluster together, and we can come up with new categories to define how the different features should be characterized. And that might ultimately show that there is indeed some clustering together of elements that were typically considered mystical, but it could as well be that the carving up of that space turns out to be quite different from what we always took for granted in the psychology of mystical experiences. One way to make this project a bit more concrete is, for instance, the Many Analysts Psychedelic Project, a project that we investigated or that we started with Johns Hopkins University. The project basically consists of a large-scale survey, including a couple of scales to measure mystical type experiences, but also other aspects of psychedelic experiences. And we use the same questions that are presented to different analysis teams to see if there's convergence or divergence in terms of like the conclusions that can be drawn based on this study. So, for instance, the central question is, if you start analyzing this data, given your preferred technique, and that could be factor analysis, network analysis, latent class analysis, etc. Is there evidence for a common factor underlying all of the different scales that are used to measure psychedelic experiences? So that provides an empirical way to give hands or to make the conceptual engineering approach a bit more concrete. Another way forward is to develop a philosophy of mystical experiences. And this is what we try to do in the Mystical Entropy project. So a quite influential hypothesis about psychedelics and mystical experiences is that these experiences seem to increase the entropy of the brain. And this is, for instance, based on work with psilocybin and LSD. It has been found that fMRI data shows increases in entropy measures in the brain. And at the same time, also many spiritual practices appear to increase the entropy of the mind. So many people go through a state of disorder in order to achieve new insight, etc. What we're trying to do in this project is to figure out what entropy could mean, and if it could be a useful notion to characterize mystical type experiences in different traditions, and also to make sense of the neuroscience of mystical experiences. So as part of this workshop, I already mentioned it, or as part of this project, we have 3 workshops. We have a special issue organized on this topic, recent blog posts, and on top of that, we also do research. So for instance, there's research on the so-called psychedelic Kundalini hypothesis, which basically is an fMRI study investigating the effect of different chakra meditations on the body and the brain. Now, if you would like to become part of this or participate in one of these workshops, please be invited to join. The next workshop will be in December, and you can go to the registration link using this QR code. I can also share the slides afterwards, of course, if you're interested in finding more about this. But for now, I would like to conclude with the prospects that the conceptual engineering approach to mystical experiences will hopefully bring more clarity to the so-called mysticism wars, and will hopefully get us a better understanding of what mystical experiences are and how we can go about measuring them to resolve some of the conundrums in the neuroscience findings, but also in the measurement of mystical experiences. That was my talk. Thanks for your attention, and maybe we have now time for questions.